Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. As always, this is your host, Coach Brad Wilson, the founder of ChasingPokerGreatness.com. Today's Friday, so I'm joined by my Friday co-host, one Duncan Palomortis. Duncan, how are we doing, sir?
Hello, hello, hello. Doing very well. How about yourself, Brad?
I'm doing quite well. Today's pretty chill, pretty relaxed. I don't got anything going on afterwards, so strap in, and apologies in advance to my podcast editor who may have a long one today. We'll see.
We can go for 3 hours.
Yeah, we're strapping in,
Strapping
getting
in
ready
for
to
a
go.
long ride.
Watch, it's going to be like a 22-minute one. Never know how
You never
things are
know.
going to turn out. Today's topic is going to be all about heuristics, and I'll let you set up, I guess, for the listener, what we mean by heuristics, and then kind of what we're about to dive into.
Right. So typically people, when they're thinking of heuristics, or sometimes call it
What is a heuristic, right? For somebody that may not know.
exactly. What is a heuristic? Or sometimes I call it noise reduction. So it's essentially a way to take typically a complicated topic, and abstractify it to its bare minimum. So to the things that are the key components of that topic, so that you can save some energy, right? So that would be the equivalent of anytime somebody is driving, for example, there is a lot of different things that they need to technically be aware of. But if we were constantly at 100% awareness every time we were driving, it would be impossible to do it. So we usually narrow our focus on a few important things. Like, for example, we're ready to hit the brakes at all times. That's a number one priority, right? I mean, so that's one heuristic, like ready to stop whenever you need to. The question which we're interested in today is, are there such ways to simplify complicated concepts in poker without sacrificing the benefits of that idea, because there is such thing as oversimplification. So is there a proper amount of simplification without going overboard, essentially?
Right, and I don't know that a heuristic has to be an oversimplification.
No, it should not be, is what
Right,
I'm saying. Yes.
right.
So
And by oversimplification, for the podcast listener as well, basically an oversimplification is when you reduce something to the point where there's distortion, right? Like,
correct. Exactly.
you know, for instance, in poker, it's never be check calling, right? This is one, this is one that's on the mind, right? Or always take an aggressive action. I think these two are kind of heuristics that poker players internalize, and there are a lot of places to apply aggression, but not every situation requires it, right?
Correct.
So yeah, I think those are the sort of like oversimplifications that you want to avoid. Anytime where you make this rule and then you can at top of mind find ways to break that rule, or situations where it doesn't it doesn't make sense. Those are oversimplifications.
Correct. And let me add to that, because I think this is a perfect example, right? The idea of people taking this to the next level, the idea of aggression. And I think I mentioned that before, right? You know, when I'm telling all my students all about the benefits of aggression, temporarily I sort of create monsters, right? I mean, they go there and they never call anything. They always re-raise, 3-bet and stuff like that. Now, let's talk a little bit about what would be a heuristic for aggression and what would be an oversimplification. A heuristic for aggression would be, in general, let's say that we want to take an aggressive action over a passive action. That would be, in general, we want to be the pre-flop raiser before the flop. In general, we want to be in position. In general, we want to have card advantage. This is what I call the trifecta. So that would be a heuristic. In general, we want to have those three things. An oversimplification would be that unless we have those three things, we don't play the hand, right? That would be an oversimplification, right? But a heuristic would be, okay, the three things, position, initiative, and card advantage, are always in the back of our head. So when we finally deviate from those three things, we need a good reason for it. So we're going to have to spend extra energy. That's the power of the heuristic. So we're sticking to those, like, let's say, initiative, position, and card advantage. But of course, there might be situations where we don't want to 3-bet somebody before the flop, and we still have position. So we're not going to have the initiative on the flop, but we still want to play the hand. So that's a situation we're saying we're deviating from the heuristic, but there is a good reason for it.
Yeah, and I actually want to address the deviating word too, because this is something that we've been upgrading in the Wolf program internally, where now the language that we use for situations like you just described it is adjustment, because we're not going away from strategy. We're layering extra data points on top of the existing strategy. So it's more of an adjustment than a deviation in my mind. And that's sort of like how I'm training the Wolves to think about those spots where it's like, okay, generally this is what we do. However, we have these 3 data points that also inform us that maybe we should prioritize those and take a different action than we have set by default. But again, it's sort of like you already have that heuristic in place and you've conserved some energy, which is another thing that I wanted to talk about as well. Well, you can use that extra energy because of the heuristic that you've saved to then layer on top other strategies.
Very good. Very good. And to add to your point, if you think about it, this is a little bit semantical, but this is Philosophical Friday, and we love we love our semantics, right?
Yeah, if there's not a place for semantics, where is there, right? This isn't it.
That's right. An adjustment is a form of deviation. So what you're actually doing there, you're being more specific, and that I love that stuff, right? So we're doing calibration on that word, and actually,
people feel bad about deviating. They feel like they're doing something wrong or contrary. An adjustment, they feel better, right?
Right, because again, deviation can be anything. It can be in the wrong direction or in the right direction. So adjustment sounds more like you narrow it down to the specific type of deviation that's relevant. It's the good one. So that's why I'm making that distinction, because I think it's helpful. No, it's helpful. So why don't we talk a little bit about that? What are, like, for example, why don't we start with what are some poker heuristics that can actually, or noise reductions that can actually save us some energy at the poker table?
So some heuristics that can save us energy at the poker table. I think it's tough, Duncan, because this is Philosophical Friday. There's lots of semantics, and there's also lots of room for adjustments in poker. Why don't you get the ball rolling? And maybe my brain will jumpstart here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, here's one important disclaimer. When I say something here, it doesn't mean all the time, but it's usually like a good rule of thumb. For example,
you generally raise first in, right? This is like pre-flop.
Exactly.
Starting there.
You raise first in, right? I mean, the trifecta that I was talking about, like initiative, position, card advantage. Another heuristic that can be very helpful, and a lot of people are going to go back on this, if there is another good player at the table, like usually I'm saying that Alex is the best player at the table, but maybe there is a second best player at the table, which is similar skill. A good heuristic would be try to avoid that player. Now, of course, there's exceptions to that. Again, when we say try to avoid, it doesn't mean we don't play against that player. But I mean, if the situation is close, we don't need to spend that energy when there's like a lower hanging fruit at the table. That'll be another helpful heuristic. And again, we can please push back on that, because I know there's a lot of
it's sort of like, I mean, live cash games are a different environment than specifically like online cash. I think live cash games. So a thing that can happen in online where, you know, there are specific positions where it's like 3-bet or fold, right? You're not supposed to flat like the cutoff facing a UTG open. However, there are instances where there are weak players in the blinds where UTG opens, where flatting the cutoff makes more sense than 3-betting and targeting a strong player who has a tight range, right? You know, that's sort of like one heuristic and then an adjustment that can be made. And it's not that you're avoiding playing against the under the gun player. It's more so that you're inviting weaker players into the party and not isolating yourself against said strong player. Now, if it's like without anything that makes me make an adjustment, so like if it's blind versus blind or like late position battles or whatever it is, like, I mean, personally, well, I'm going to battle with him. But if there's room to invite somebody else into the party that I think will result in a higher EV situation that's downstream, then I'm going to take that action. But I do disagree with like outright avoiding situations where I can manage to find plus EV spots, or that I think is a plus EV spot that I can quantify.
Okay, very good. And I agree with you 100%. By the way, there are plus EV spots, but why, you know, using energy, which we have a limited amount of, you know, like sitting there at the poker table for 10 hours to get a marginally plus EV spot in a certain situation, when we can use some of that energy to get to the low hanging fruit. Now, if the table is more on the lower end in terms of opportunities, then I would agree with you 100%. Then we have to take every plus EV we can. But the question is it meta plus EV to take every plus EV opportunity at the table? Or it would become a little bit less plus EV even to just, try to squeeze every little bit of value against the better players instead of just saving our energy for the lower hanging fruit? That's the question that I'm asking.
Yeah, so it's like you're walking through this environment that's low visibility, and you see like a grape, and you're like, I could eat this grape, but maybe there's like a watermelon if I keep walking a little bit further, right?
But you also have some evidence that it might be a watermelon, right? Because you're probably like let's say in a garden, right, where you're expecting it, right? So sure. This is relevant, right? Because if we don't have the evidence, that's different. If we're like in a random room where with just see a grape, maybe
but we can't go back either.
Okay, sure.
Once we walk past this grape, there's no turning back the other way.
No turning back
to go get that grape.
Right.
To me, that boils down to, and I agree with you about having finite energy and finite willpower. I think this is like a pretty easy thing to agree with. The part that I would contest is that live poker is such a less mentally strenuous activity compared to like online poker that I don't know that having 10 of those situations is going to like make it to where I can't play for like 10 hours or miss out on opportunity downstream. I guess that would be the area that like I feel is questionable. It is like, well, there may be watermelons, but like I'm kind of a glutton here, and I want the grape and I want the watermelon should the watermelon come my way. And banking on my belief that I can recover in the interim and not just totally shut down after like 10 to 12 hours of live poker, because like you don't VPIP a lot, you don't play a lot of hands,
right.
You sit there for the most part. So that would be the part of that I would contest.
Right. Essentially, that what you're saying is that doesn't invalidate the point. You're essentially saying I have enough energy. My arm is strong enough to take the grape and the watermelon later.
Yeah,
and that's perfectly fine. As long as you don't feel like you're depleting your energy in any way, shape, or form, that's perfectly fine. And I agree with that. If there is it also depends on the skill differential at the table. Yeah. Anyway.
Making some clear assumptions that we have like effectively unlimited bankroll, that we don't have to leave the game if we get busted.
Right.
I think that's something that those are areas where you can and should pass up plus EV opportunities or marginally plus EV opportunities. There was a Tactical Tuesday a while back with a player who basically went out of their way to 3-bet out of position versus, the second strongest player at the table when they had limited funds, and like if they go broke, they can't rebuy and stay in the game. And the game was full of like a bunch of weak players, right? I think that's like a clear spot where, we're playing the infinite game here, and rule number 1 is to stay in the game.
Right.
So if that's a downside risk that you can't stay in the game if you do go broke, then yeah, I think that situation you should certainly pass up a plus EV spot that's kind of marginal in search of the higher EV watermelons.
Right. That's a good point. And actually, that reminds me also of another heuristic, which is sort of relevant. The infinite bankroll is very relevant, but at the same time, it might be helpful to have a sort of like a stop loss for the day, right? I mean, the sort of like the Phil Ivey quote, I don't care how good you are, if you're losing, you're not playing as good as usual. Of course, again, that doesn't invalidate the point. If somebody's playing really well when they're losing, that's perfectly fine. That person doesn't need that heuristic in place, obviously. But like another heuristic would be,
yeah, it goes both ways, right? I think some people who are masochistic, or I don't exactly know how to describe them. Myself is one of them. Like when I lose 2 or 3 buy-ins and get punched in the face, there's some sort of internal system that turns on that makes me focus more and just play everything with a higher intensity level. And I just have my energy is seemingly like endless for whatever reason. I don't know why it takes me getting punched in the face a couple times to wake up, but it does. And I know other players who, yeah, they get punched in the face a couple times and they're kind of done, right? But I also think that it's very difficult to self-assess when you have a stop loss in the moment when you need to self-assess and be honest with yourself, because like you're never in the right mindset to actually leave when you reach your stop loss, because I drove 45 minutes to get here, traffic's bad right now, the game is really good. There's always a reason to keep playing another orbit. So yeah, I mean, I think stop losses are like good in theory and practice. I'm not exactly sure, and also it depends on the person.
I do
Yeah.
have a heuristic for that, by the way, because incidentally, what you're describing, it sounds a lot like me. Like, I mean, I'm incredibly competitive, so like there's this inner drive. However, the difference that I would say, it sounds like you like that part of yourself, like the extra focus and the extra.
I love it.
I like, yeah.
I pride myself in it.
Good.
Like,
And that's excellent. Personally, I like to be more on the sort of like getting to that state on demand versus sort of like being forced by external forces. And that's just a different approach. What is my heuristic, since we're talking about heuristic for these stop losses? Always bring cash at the casino, no credit cards, no debit cards, nothing else. So once you're done with the cash that you have available, you can't borrow, you can't do nothing. You just leave.
Yeah. I personally don't like that one.
Yeah.
But
okay. That makes sense.
Like that one goes, because like to me, I can again get pummeled and be in a good game and be like, okay, well, I've lost more than I thought I would. However, mentally, I'm feeling good. The game is good, and leaving the game is just a missed opportunity to me.
That makes sense. Yes. And again, you bring two important points. Number one, different heuristics work for different people, right? I mean, this is a very, very important one, right?
Right.
And the other point is, once again, it all comes down to, am I willing to spend the energy to make the decision? Part of the reason why I'm using that heuristic for myself is because I don't want to make that decision. I don't want to spend the energy to decide, should I continue playing while I'm losing? Should I, am I in the right mental state of mind? Some people, they're okay making that decision. So it really comes down to, your willpower and, how much
well, to me, it's already pre-made, right? Because I have my heuristic in place of like, if the game is good and I'm feeling good mentally, then I continue, right?
So, but you have to decide if you think the game is good, though.
Yeah.
It's not always. I'm going to push back on this, because it's not like we have to make a decision. Do we think the game is good? And that can actually be a complicated answer sometimes, right? I mean, we can see a spot, but maybe there's like an aggressive.
It's live poker. It's live. The game's always good.
I love it. I mean,
the downside to the game always being good is that, of course, you can quit and come back and the game is good. But I think that like these are things that you can measure, whether as an experienced poker player, to me, it doesn't take a ton of mental energy to really quantify like, I'm on the direct left of a whale who's built up 5 buy-ins, right? It doesn't take me very much thinking to realize this game is good and this is a good opportunity,
Right. To be fair, you're describing an extreme scenario, which has an easy answer, right?
Sure.
I mean, what I'm saying is that what if the situation is more complicated? Like there's like 2 loose passive players at the other side of the table, and there's like a very aggressive player to your immediate left, so you're targeting those guys. I mean, what I'm saying is that there can be situations which are more gray than black and white.
Yeah. I guess it always boils down. It's very it's very black and white for me, of like, when I play poker, I have an edge for the most part, right?
Or you wouldn't be there. I agree with that 100%.
Right. Or I believe that I have an edge, right? And if the game is like somewhat normal, there's nothing outrageously different about it compared to like every day-to-day situation, and I get buried 4 hours in, but I was planning on playing 10, leaving the game is detrimental to my bottom line at the end of the year if I feel as if I still have an edge in the game, right? So I don't give myself the really option to just leave, because if I leave 10 times over the course of a year, then I've just cut out 60 hours that I could have played, and that my belief is that I'm plus EV, and lose that income over the course of the year. So that's sort of like, honestly, the game being bad to me in a live setting is more of an extreme scenario, because it's just rarely the case. like up to 5-10 at least. It's just rarely like, oh, this game's really bad, I'm just gonna quit, right? Like,
oh no, I don't think I've ever been in a bad game, to be honest with you. So it's not so much like, the really like a game where I'm thinking to myself, oh my god, this game is terrible. I've been to games which are like okay, but I've never like been in a situation where I think like the game is bad.
Right. So if the game is never bad, then doesn't take much energy to.
Well, again, the reason I would push back on that is because then you have to make a decision. First of all, am I equally as passive? Am I playing well? That's another question, which is important. Am I okay? Yes. If you never deviate from your typical, and when I'm talking about like deviate, I don't mean monkey tilt necessarily, but like sometimes you can be on your B- game, and that B- game can be borderline, or it can be depends on the situation. Again, like in an okay game, your B- game could be borderline. And then is it worth it to be there? So that's a decision that could be, worth it.
Yeah. Which is like kind of baked into my process, right? Of like, am I playing well? Like, right. Do I believe I can continue? Do I have enough energy to continue? Do I think I'm playing well? If so, then keep playing. And
so the takeaway, Brad is a robot confirmed. He never deviates from absolute best game. So
no,
I love it. No. That's
I will lose
some
energy.
People more consistent than others. So I love it. Yeah, why not? Some people are, they more. My wife is like that. She's very consistent. The most consistent human being I've ever seen in my life. Some people are like that.
It's quite obvious to me when I'm not consistent, because I can feel it. I know when something bugs me that otherwise wouldn't bug me, right? I have all these indicators in my awareness of like, I'm frustrated that I haven't gotten to 3-bet in the last 45 minutes. I'm frustrated that I haven't gotten to VPIP in the last 25 minutes. That guy 2 seats away said something that annoyed me, that under normal circumstances wouldn't have annoyed me. All of these things, these inputs, to me are data. And
another heuristic, by the way, right? If you know you're frustrated, that's beautiful, because you mentioned that, right? So that's another heuristic. Very good. And what do you do in situations like that?
I generally quit.
Okay.
Unless,
that's your trigger.
That's a trigger. I generally quit because that's what allows me to have awareness that like I'm not in the right state to be here, and my decision making is most likely compromised. I'm certainly not afraid to say that when my willpower drops, because I think it's more a symptom of lack of willpower at that point. At the end of the day, some donuts look pretty freaking good.
Absolutely.
They look nice.
Nothing wrong with donuts, man. That's insane.
Right. So like this is an indicator too that once my willpower is depleted,
right,
and I will eat these donuts late at night, but I don't wake up in the morning eating them because I still have enough willpower to say no, that when my willpower is depleted, my cognitive ability, my decision-making is also compromised. And when that happens, playing poker is not the place that I need to be. So that, to me, that's my trigger. It's not, losing X amount of money. It's like, I just don't have it right now and I need to go recover.
That's great. And that is another excellent heuristic. And then one other heuristic I just thought while you were talking is you were talking about specifically about frustration, and you're talking about the idea of willpower. What are some things I was thinking that draining our willpower, right? And that could be fatigue, it could be hunger, it could be sex drive. So usually say
generally not sex drive when I'm playing poker.
Well, okay. So one of the heuristics I'm using is don't play hungry, tired, or horny, right? Or drunk, right? I mean that's the important things, because again that can.
What poker games are you playing in, Duncan? I don't know. We're not playing in the same poker games. I don't.
If your testosterone levels are too high, like you may be overly aggressive, right? Yes. So that's.
Oh, now I see why you like the aggression so much. It's all making sense to me now.
It makes Then we have our favorite, is one of the people that we both admire, as far as I can tell, Tommy Angelo. One of his heuristics, which I think they're pretty interesting. He calls them the automatic folders. Not the envelopes, the hands that you should fold automatically, right? I mean, he says if I'm under the gun and I don't see an ace, like that hand is automatically a fold or something like that. And I think that's actually pretty brilliant. Like the idea of having sort of automatic decisions. Now, of course, there are exceptions. if we don't understand those exceptions, I mean, this wouldn't be heuristics unless we understood the exceptions. It's just that those exceptions usually happen infrequently. But
Well,
go ahead.
I think, I mean, the personal downside to Tommy's specific heuristic there is that would take the more fun out of the game for me. I like playing hands. I like being involved. I like being put into challenging situations that I've got to think my way out of, right? Like
I agree.
those are the things that like make poker so fun to me, that like I can't imagine eliminating, you know, the muck and the mud and the confusing spots and the challenges like that. But again, that's my personal preference.
No, this is beautiful, because essentially what you're saying is that, you know, heuristics are one thing, but I mean, what separates a good player from a great player is that a great player adjusts. I'm not going to use the word deviates, right? So you want to keep that adjustment live, and I agree 100%. I mean, you want to be able to adjust, but the heuristics are not there in place of the adjustments. Are just there as a core approach, so that you, again, to eliminate noise and to save energy.
And for the most part, like Tommy's heuristic is probably quite beneficial, right? To the general poker population, and then there are different subsets of that general population that I think it's less beneficial to, or less appealing to, I guess I should say.
Sure. And to himself, right? I mean, you know, that's probably why he has those heuristics, right? Because they work for him first, right? Usually when somebody talks about heuristics, is what works for them versus is going to work to the other people. It could be, for example, in his case, and I'm speculating, but I can imagine that somebody may want to maintain a sort of like, it's easier to maintain a Zen sort of like approach by, you know, making quick, easy decisions. Yeah, so
it is for sure, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah. So
it's a fun opening, whatever, you know, King 10 suited from under the gun and getting 3-bet from an aggressive player who's in the cutoff, right? That's not a fun spot to be in.
Not fun times, that's for sure. And I think you alluded to earlier about, you know, but because I like how clearly you see the disadvantages of the heuristic. So let's speak about those disadvantages a little bit more clearly. What are some of the disadvantages of heuristics? And first of all, are the heuristics even necessary?
Well, we'll start with the disadvantages. I mean, they can stifle growth. I think that's a clear disadvantage. You know, if you don't open a hand that doesn't have an ace in it, then, well, there are plus EV options that are available in that situation. But by not putting yourself in that spot, you're less comfortable navigating it. You don't gain reps. I think that there's a lot of it's actually a lot of negative EV things you could do in the moment that are positive EV over the long run. You sort of alluded to it a couple of Philosophical Fridays ago with that calibration period of going back and forth until you find kind of the optimal spot to be in. If you don't put yourself in those spots ever, you never get to calibrate, you never learn, and you never grow. I think that's a downside. So it limits growth. I think another possible downside, you could limit opportunity in the case that we were talking about earlier, where you lose X amount of money and you don't get to keep playing. I think that could limit opportunity. And also just the major downside is in oversimplifying. It's in accepting heuristics that are just wrong and bad and negative EV and cost you money, time, energy, whatever it is, that you set it and forget it. You never go back and ask, is this beneficial? Is this true? Is this right? And also setting heuristics without understanding the big picture, which is how those inaccurate heuristics get set in the first place. So someone who creates heuristics that is on the side of the Dunning-Kruger spectrum where they're just learning something, I think is very detrimental to humans.
Very good. And I would add to that, another possible downside is, as it relates exactly to what you just said, you cannot necessarily get the heuristics from somebody else. You have to create them yourself. That's the very relevant point, I think, that you're making over there, right? That's the difference, right? Because if you're taking the heuristics from somebody else, then you haven't had the nuance that was included in those heuristics before they became heuristic. That's the important part, right? I mean, you haven't seen the people trying all those sorts of different things in so many different ways. And then eventually they said, you know what, that's basically the meat and potatoes of what I've been doing for so long. I've been trying to raise, I've been trying to call, and it looks like, by raising before the flop, by not limping, most of the time it's better than limping. So I'm just going to have a heuristic of raising instead of limping. But it doesn't take into account all of these exceptions that the person who tried both of different approaches still understands and will still deviate or adjust in certain situations to actually incorporate them. It is important for someone to create sort of like their own heuristics. That is not to say that we cannot be inspired by somebody else's heuristics and then try them out, but it's important to integrate them into our own personal gameplay.
Right. We need to understand that the part of the iceberg that's underneath the surface.
Exactly.
Before we apply the heuristics. I think too, human beings, for better or worse, are kind of hardwired to make these little rules that help us, that save cognitive energy and help us navigate. And in poker, it's very difficult to broadly say, oh, this is what you do in this situation forever until the end of time, right? It's like, it's a classic cliche of ask a poker coach, give them a hand, and you ask, like, well, what should I do? And then the answer is like, it depends, right? It depends, because it's not so cut and dry as to seeing what someone does and being like, oh, so you just check raise eights on a 10-7 deuced flop, right? Like, oh, that's how you play eights. You just check raise it, right? Well, no, I mean, we don't know the situation. There's a lot of data points that like you're not understanding, you're not evaluating it. And especially in like plain explained videos, or, like Berkey was on last week, like Poker Out Loud, there is some dilution that happens when you verbalize what you're thinking before you take an action. And you're not able to state every single thing that you are considering that goes into that decision. And in that dilution, the people who consume said material can come to incorrect conclusions and think that they are correct. So any heuristic, I think, in poker, it's very serious business, because making a heuristic that is incorrect is so detrimental. And also detrimental just because eventually, if you take the game seriously, you have to unlearn that heuristic. And that is not a fun thing to do, right? It's not fun to unlearn something that you're very confident that is true and beneficial. And this just happens quite often in, private coaching. It happens quite often, even in my CFP, the Wolves program, where someone believes something, are presented with evidence that's contrary to their belief. And now we have a situation.
That's
what
right.
do I trust? Who do I trust? Myself, who made this thing? Or do I trust this outside information that seems to be challenging what I myself believe? And then, that's a spot that's like, it's a really hard situation. I can speak from the coaching side to get somebody to release said heuristic.
Very good. And it also ties to the idea of habitual thinking, right? Because once something becomes a habit, it is difficult also to change from that habit too. So it's not only part of the belief, which is one thing, it's also a part of habit. So we have a specific physical response to it, which is difficult to get out of. It's like quitting smoking. And it's funny how I'm using these examples of things that I've never done before in my life. But I know, like 70% of Greeks, when I was in Greece, like that was 15 years ago, at least 70% of them were smoking or some ridiculous amount, and I know it's very difficult to quit smoke anyway. So it gets really difficult.
Well, again, like going to the nature of us, like we believe these things, like, a bird in the hand is better than two in the bush, or whatever that silly expression is, right? Like,
right.
That's just not true. It's not true that like something today is better than something 2 weeks from now, or is always better, right? It depends based on certain variables of the situation. Right. And I think that just like as the human race, we accept these things as like truth, and then never go back and analyze it and ask, well, wait a minute here. Like, surely we can do better, right? We can think about this with a little bit more depth and come to some better conclusions.
Absolutely. And I think that's very relevant and important. And once again, we see the idea of relativity, right? I mean, it really depends on the situation. It depends on the person. It depends on the circumstances. So now that you've very well illustrated the downside of relying too much on heuristics or making them the end all be all, are they necessary? And are they
Yes.
useful?
They are useful. Okay. I think so. I think they're necessary, and I think they are useful when done correctly. But they must be trained and done correctly, quantified correctly, and also created with the information that these are not locked in place. This can be flexible over time. If we learn something different, then we should upgrade this heuristic, right? We shouldn't just, stick to our guns, right? Which is like kind of, that's another thing that heuristic that to me is kind of not so helpful. Sticking to your guns.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I think it's really bad.
Or having the power of your own conviction. I never understood that phrase. It's like, it's anybody who has the power of their own conviction. I mean, it's sort of like feel sorry for them, not proud of them. It's like, what does it mean to you? Like, that means that you're not gonna be flexible to your environment. That's dangerous. You're not gonna
change. You're gonna get new information and not change your opinion based on new data and new information. That to me seems counterproductive. But we live in a society that really does not like it when people change their opinions. That will call people hypocrites, and that will call people, I guess I'll date myself, but John Kerry versus George W. Bush election, it was, John Kerry's a flip-flopper, right? Well, like, it seems psychotic to have a belief that gets challenged, get presented with new information that's contrary to your belief, and be like, no, I'm good. I still believe that, right? No, like, how does that make any sense?
It doesn't.
Yeah, right. Like, that's not like who we ought to strive to be as society. Right. So yeah. Anyway, but I do think that heuristics are useful. I think they're beneficial. They save brain power, they save willpower, they save energy. If they're done correctly, they can be insanely powerful because it gives you the space to use that energy that you save in the poker setting is what I'm referring to right now for other decisions, which is insanely valuable.
Absolutely. If I may, there is an important point that I would like us to dive into a little bit. And that's the point of, we talked about this in very, very, very first podcast when I was your guest, the idea of meta-humility. How does this tie to all of the topic that we're discussing? Because on the one hand, we both agree detrimental to have like a set in stone opinion on anything when it comes to poker. But on the other hand, we do not want to be the guy who every response we have to deal with is it depends. Like, we don't, and what I mean by that, we do not have to be indecisive. It depends. It's okay to say it depends and then decide. But what if we're like, oh, it depends. It could be this way or the other way or the other. And then we are stuck in an infinite loop of indecision, right?
It's Chitty from The Good Place, right?
Correct. Exactly. Exactly. No, exactly. That's perfect. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Like, how do we rectify the two? And I'll let you start and I'll share my thoughts as well.
I think that eventually you have to make a decision. So basically, like, that's one part of it is like, if you don't know the answer or if it's unclear, then you have some investigation to do. I think that will cause you to grow as a human being or as a poker player. So if you really don't know and you're really on the fence and it depends, it says that either A, the spot is too close. And then if that's the case, then it doesn't matter what you do. Like, either both options are just a toss up, or if the spot is not ultra close one way or the other, which is a hard thing for one human being to see if they lack information or lack knowledge, right? This would be a classic blind spot situation for a student. Then they need to like hit the books and they need to try to figure out the problem. So I guess for me, it's try to figure out the problem to the best of your ability. See if you're lacking any information. If you can't figure it out, then it's likely just too close and you can just kind of let it go. And if you can figure it out, then you learn and you grow. Like that to me is how you get out of that loop.
Exactly. And I would say the same thing. I will just, add terminology to it, right? So you're basically saying that there is a certain opportunity to learn that permeates on the side, right? I mean, you're saying, listen, I'm going to do what I have to do right now. And if I have to adjust it or deviate or whatever word we want to use later, I'm going to do that if new evidence presents itself. That's what I like to call meta-humility. But in the moment, and I think this is the only thing which I think, like I will use different wording, is that when we have to act, because we either have to go left or right or whatever the directions are.
Yeah,
at that moment, that's just 100%. Like when we say something, it's 100%. It sounds like we're the most, confident people on the entire planet. But that's why meta-humility lives at a different level. We cannot act without being confident. When we act, even if it's the wrong decision, and I often tell that to my students, a wrong decision is better than no decision. Make a decision and stand behind it. That doesn't mean you're right, and that doesn't mean you should think you're right. But at the moment, that's a different thing. Like at the moment, it's what we decide to do. And that's where the idea of everlasting learning that permeates on the side, that's essentially meta-humility. In that sense, nothing is certain. Like, nothing I ever say, I know it to be true. Like not even the things that I spent, more than 30,000 hours working on, I'm talking about math, it doesn't mean I know anything, right? But I always speak with confidence because we have to talk about the moment.
Right. And also the person who's never wrong never learns anything as well. Like the person who is always right about everything, they go through their whole life, they never learn anything.
Correct.
Because they don't need to, right? They have all the answers, right?
They do already have all the answers, exactly. So we do want, again, we do want something often to be a mistake so that we can improve. That's actually a very good and subtle point. One thing that you mentioned earlier, and I think it was a very relevant and very good point. You were talking about how students sometimes they're sold on a certain idea, and they have an external factor that it sort of tries to change their mind, or at least give them some evidence to start thinking or trigger the learning process. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think that's interesting to me. How do we deal with someone, whether it's in the education business or in a situation where there is someone who has a very solid conviction on something, and yet they're trying to learn or they're trying to improve? How do you approach a situation like that?
And they're quantifiably incorrect.
Well, at a meta-humility level, there's nobody ever correct or incorrect in my mind. But we have strong evidence. That's what I'm saying, right? I mean, but we have strong evidence to believe.
Well, they believe that open jamming do 7 off makes money, right?
Exactly.
And they fundamentally believe this, right?
They fundamentally believe that, which, by the way, this is just because it is Philosophical Friday. That could actually be true in a certain weird environment where, like you dealing with like the super needs, or I don't know, like some super, that's what philosophers do sometimes. They come up with those examples that never existed or never will exist. But yeah, sure. You're absolutely correct. So something like that.
Yeah. It depends. So to tie into our conversation, it depends.
Right.
The experienced, wiser version of myself as a coach would say, if it happens routinely, then I give them a refund and cut bait.
Oh, I love that.
Okay. That's like what I do with a student who, I think challenging is good. I think to continue challenging something in the face of someone that you're paying who's showing you evidence to the contrary is not someone who's going to benefit from coaching, and is someone who's going to make my life miserable over time at the same time. And so the best thing that I can do in that case is say, all right, I think you're a great person. We tried, it's just not a good fit. And I think you should, look for a coach elsewhere. I have some coaches that, maybe I want to torture that you can go contact.
Every person is different, right? So
every coaches are different too. I think like there are different styles of coaching. There are different styles of learning. There are things that resonate with different players in different ways.
Some more masochistic than others.
Some more masochistic than others. The unwise version of myself wanted to try to beat them down with logical, rational thought and do what I could to change their mind, right? Like, no, you're seeing it wrong. Like, how do I make you see this correctly, right? But that is just kind of a futile effort once they're dug in. And I also think that people who dig in like that really have to think about what they're doing and whether or not they actually actively want to learn and grow, because that is not really a paradigm that facilitates a lot of growth.
That's right. And I think that highly depends on whether that person is stuck just because they've been doing something for a long time, but they're willing to change, or they're stuck because, again, they're very stubborn about the way they're approaching life. I mean, for example, I had a student who's been playing poker for 8 years before we met, and he was break even at best, right? And he was doing certain things. He was very willing to change his ways. He was resistant at certain things, but he was willing to actually try things that can work. And spoiler alert, it did. So it does matter whether or not somebody is actually interested in changing.
Yeah, and I mean, some things is okay. I guess the cases I'm more describing are extreme examples of, like, again, like, everything is a challenge. Like, oh, why should I call this bet on the river? Well,
right.
You've got 45% equity and you need 30, and like I can show you that that you have 45% equity. Like, well, how do you know? Like that's sort of like, okay, like this is not going anywhere here.
Sure. And one thing I would add to this, because this is something that I've been thinking quite a lot, and it's not just poker, it extends to mathematics as well, and in general, in discussion and conversations. I think something which I personally find it helpful, and I try to do that in the book. Whether I succeeded or not is another story. But I don't typically like to tell people what to do. Even though, like, I am, sounding like very firm in the things that I say, I don't tell people what to do. And I think the reason for that is because I don't think it matters what you tell people. Really, what it matters is what people are going to tell themselves to do. So one sort of like a workaround, going to discuss an idea, but then don't tell the person what to do, is suggest ways of thinking about it. So for me, like, poker education is not about...
You just trick them, Duncan. You just trick them. That's what I do.
There's that too. That's an excellent one.
Yeah.
They'll take the psychopathic approach.
Yeah,
trick people.
No,
I love that.
Actually, I'll discuss what I mean after you get done with your point.
Right. So the idea is that it's more about, like, the classic phrase, of course, is, give a man a fish versus teach him how to fish. But essentially, for me, it's not even teaching them how to fish. It's teaching them what to think and what questions to ask. Really, what questions to ask, right? Because once you start asking those questions, you're halfway there. And then if they need help with those answers, we can go and approach them. But for me, it is the most important thing is asking the questions. Like, you want to decide preflop charts. We're talking about preflop charts with Matt last week and how non-beneficial they can be, how detrimental can be to someone's poker game. Okay, somebody says, give me poker charts. Okay, how are these poker charts created? That's the question. And now they start thinking themselves, how are you, like, why is this hand here and not there? What are you trying to achieve? And then they start realizing, oh, okay, maybe 7-8 suited is more playable than 7-3 suited. So at some point, some of these hands are not very playable, perhaps. Okay, so then you can ask yourself the question, do I find this hand to be playable, in a certain situation? That's already better than just following a chart, right? And then you can start questions like, which position would you going to be in and why? People start asking those questions.
The problem with that approach is people can, the solver doesn't tell you why. I've tried again and again to whisper sweet nothings in the solver's ear, but it doesn't tell me why it does some of the things that it does. It refuses. And so it's abstract information that we try to conceptualize. And the downside of that is conceptualizing it incorrectly or attributing a false why that leads people kind of astray downstream, which is, obviously bad. So,
and that's part of the problems that we talked about of the solvers, right? That's a big issue that the solvers have, right? That means they don't allow people to do the necessary critical thinking. And also, most people don't understand what the underlying assumptions are for the solvers to give the answers that they give. Yes, exactly. It's very important. Yeah.
And I guess I'll go back to what I was saying before about tricking people. Well, I guess I'll have to address that.
Sure.
But basically, by trick people, I mean, there's a place that you want them to arrive at and that you know is the most beneficial place for them to arrive at, and they're not seeing it. And so you prime them with questions that help move them along to the right place, right?
Right.
So basically, they come to the right conclusion on their own through your assistance, and basically believe that they came to the conclusion on their own, right? They arrive at the place where
Mhm.
you know they need to be, and you've kind of let them
Sure,
believe that they found it on their own.
sure.
That was what I meant by tricking
Sure,
someone.
sure. That's perfectly fine, and there's nothing wrong with that approach. Eh,
Yeah, it was framed as a not a good thing to do, I think, though.
No, 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 no.
By me.
No, no, no. That's fine. The only except for me is that I don't think there is a right place. Like again, we're getting back into that,
Well,
issue. And what I mean by there's no right place is that specifically in poker, there are things that work for one player that do not work for another. Like, like
yeah.
dealing with losses, for example, is a perfect example of that, right? When people find different heuristics and different approaches.
Yeah, this is more like some tactical based again that I can quantify and show them, like,
But don't you think
through.
there's different styles that can be equally beneficial in poker?
I think that if your opponent bets and you have enough equity to call and it's quantifiable, then you should call. Like that
Right,
to me is like cut and dry, right? But I
right.
need to lead them to that place, and I think there is like right and wrong, right? Where
For sure. No, no, no. I'm not getting into the total relativism right here.
yeah,
But don't you think that whether or not, this is the right call is highly dependent on the person who is sitting at the table? And I don't mean the opponent. I mean the actual, like, can you envision a situation where if you were sitting at the table, it would be a fault for you given how you're playing, but for your student, it should be a call given that they're playing differently? That's what I mean.
no.
You see, that's the difference, because I don't think all the situations are exactly the same, because you versus your student, you may, unless you have, of course, like similar ranges and you do everything identically. Like, for example, your student might have missed a bet on the flop that you wouldn't have. And
Well, I thought we were presuming it was an identical spot where someone bets on the river. I have enough equity to call, whether it's me,
Okay.
you, my cat. I think that you should always call.
Okay, so I guess we're making different assumptions. Yes, under those assumptions that we know it's clear mathematically what the ranges are, it's clear
Right.
what our equity is. Yes, I agree. Okay, this is the point that I was trying to
Because we said it was like an identical spot with
no.
different people
Yeah.
transposed, right?
Right. I should clarify this. What I meant by identical is that it was similar bets, but you reached to that point in different ways. That's what I was silently assuming. But
that is not identical, Duncan.
Understood.
That is very different.
Understood. So the path is not identical. I agree with you. I was like saying the snapshot of the final situation is identical. But it's good that you're doing that, because by pushing back and clarifying that point, I think you're clearly illustrating here the difference between what I'm talking about is that I'm talking about the different path. And if the different path is different, the reason why the path is different actually depends highly on who's employing that strategy. And there is a certain amount of subjectivity that goes into who's employing that strategy to create potentially different outcomes. But once all those assumptions have been solved for, so we know exactly what the frequencies are in all spots, then there is a correct and wrong answer. But what I'm saying, the way to get there is very different from person to person, and that's what matters really, because really these are the important questions. The question is, how many hands do you play from that position? What is your sizing in those situations? What is the history you have with your opponent? Like, have you been, and then psychological factors, which are different from player to player. I do think that that's the important difference there.
Yeah, and I would, in the situation that you just described, I wouldn't even prioritize the action on the river. I would prioritize all the things that you mentioned leading up to that decision, which
exactly my
are
point.
Integrated into their thought process and how they're thinking about, like, from a teaching and educator perspective, right? I think that the actual decision is almost irrelevant or immaterial.
Exactly my point. Because at that point, there is a single right or wrong answer, right? I mean, at that point, when we've done all of these assumptions, but really the key in winning poker is in calibrating the assumptions correctly. That's all it comes down to. It's a game of imperfect information. So if we can actually calibrate the information correctly, then we're getting closer to being a winning player. But that information depends highly on the strategy that we're using.
And this is, sorry.
No, that's it.
I was going to say,
getting excited.
Yeah. I think honestly, these are the differences between like a high level coach and a low level coach. And if I look at my own progression, I realize that the thing that I've gotten quite good at in coaching is getting people to ask the right questions to
Right.
themselves
Right.
and getting people to think in the correct way by asking them really solid, good questions that give them the space to learn and realize it for themselves, right? I think that's really the communication side of teaching, and that's the area that's most been upgraded over the past few years of doing tons and tons of private coaching. Is like, how do I effectively communicate this information so that it sticks and resonates with the student and actually helps them moving forward? That I think, like a lot of lower levels or inexperienced coaches, I think that's the thing where they struggle. They struggle the most to do that with their students.
Correct. And it's actually very difficult, right? Because it's easier to tell somebody what to do. It's always harder to help them think for themselves, because that requires you to think, and you have to think at a meta level, because you have to think at what are the possible different ways they can think.
You have to understand it from two perspectives, right? You have to understand it from their paradigm and your paradigm, and try to guide them in bridging that gap. And that is quite difficult because everybody's different. Everybody starts from a different paradigm. And so, like, there's this acclimation period where you're feeling a student out and asking them questions and seeing where they're coming from and how they think. And then you can plug into that and kind of lead them to where they need to go.
Exactly. And the joke that I always use in class is that I can probably guess how you played the first hand of poker you ever played. The first hand of No Limit Hold'em. You likely called the big blind, the first hand you actually played, right? You didn't raise. So that's the argument of sometimes professional poker players or experienced poker players, they know other players better than they know themselves in some sense, because again, they have this huge spectrum of data points that they can extrapolate from. Right?
Well, that's what makes great poker players. I mean, that's what differentiates the crushers from the average regs that exist in the world. Is like, the crushers know exactly what someone's thinking and understands what they're doing better than the person themselves. That allows them to operate from a higher level and find the holes in said player's strategy that they can exploit.
Very good. It's such a wonderful conversation. It's so much fun talking to you, Brad. I'm just gonna let you know that.
Thank you, Duncan. I need you to write that. Can we get that notarized and sent to my wife?
Absolutely. Timestamped. I have this idea that I wrote in the book. I call this the hypothetical strategy manual, where every person, whether they know it or not, they have sort of like a hypothetical strategy manual that basically gives them answers to what they would do in all hypothetical situations. I mean, some of these situations haven't happened yet, but given how they're wired and what information they have, they're probably going to make a certain decision, and that decision is sort of like predetermined based on who they are in some sense. Not to get all deterministic about the universe or anything like that, but I call it the hypothetical strategy manual. And because we're talking about heuristics, I do feel that a lot of people play in that hypothetical strategy manual. Technically, theoretically, is million pages long, if not infinitely many pages long, right? Because it has to answer the question, if my opponent is drinking and wears a red shirt and they haven't bet a hand in 3 hours and they check raise me, what should I do? Like, it should have the answer there because it's the answer to everything. However, this gigantic hypothetical strategy manual, once people start merging things together, you know what, I have ace king, I can't fold that hand, I call. Or I have pair on the river, I call. Then it simplifies, because it says, if you have a pair on the river and you get bet, you call. So most players, even though their hypothetical strategy manual is gigantic, the relevant parts of that hypothetical strategy manual, they're just basically narrowed down to a few things. And this is actually how professionals take advantage of recreational players, and how people like, Daniel Negreanu, says, oh, you have a set. And he sounds like a genius, right? I mean, how did he know? Well, because they do one of, 10 or 20 things, which are similar to,
Right. It's critical thinking and problem solving and matching past experience to the current moment, right?
So that will also be an example of bad heuristics, by the way, right? I mean, somebody who's basically saying, I have a pair on the river, therefore I call. That's an example, like an exaggerated.
I have another. I guess I'll close on this example of bad heuristic because
Sure.
the story just popped in my head, which I think is quite an interesting. It's a funny story.
I
So
love stories.
I was playing at a home game, maybe 10 years ago, maybe longer than that now. Jeez. And I kind of terrorized the home game. I think I lost like the first two sessions at this specific game, and then I won for like 4 months straight, 2 nights a week. Like I just didn't lose. And I got it in on the turn with a set against a player that I had been beating up over time. We got it in, and he had a straight. Right, he turned some weird gut shot, and
Whereabouts?
the board paired the river. Right,
Nice.
and the dealer pushes me in the pot, and he kind of stands up, like I guess he lost his buy-in for the day, and walks around, and like I'm stacking the chips up, not really saying much. And I feel him behind me, right? He
Oh
like
my God.
grabs my shoulders, right?
Oh no.
And immediately I'm like tense, right? And he just like sat there, and he was like, you know what, boys, the cream always rises to the crop. And then he walked away, and that was it. And that was and his bad heuristic was that it was inevitable. I was going to
It's
get his
inevitable.
money no matter
No
what,
matter
right?
what. Right. Exactly.
And so yeah, that's my funny story of a bad heuristic that is quite beneficial to me in my image and how people played against me at
Right.
that period in time, that it was inevitable that I get the money. But the reality was, I got it in bad, of course.
Right. And this is very relevant what you're talking about. This is the idea, the value of image, especially if we're playing live. I mean, most of when we're playing live. That's why a winning image has equity, because when people start to think that they're going to lose against you because you're winning no matter what, then they're going to start making incorrect folds. So you can get extra equity out of this. And I think that's relevant. And it still, by the way, factors in, like Barry Greenstein would say, people usually play a lot when they're losing and very little when they're winning. It should be the opposite. You should play a lot when you're winning because you have the image equity, and then less when you're losing. But as we established today, different people do different things. Yeah.
And also, talking's hard. I messed up my story at the end. The cream rises to the top.
To the top. Yeah. No,
I combined the cream of the
Yeah.
crop and the cream rises to the top. I put them together during the punchline. But yeah, basically.
I'm not going to correct you in English, Brad. I'm making like 10 grammatical mistakes.
As soon as I said it, I was like,
2 sentences. So
that doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem right. The cream rises to the crop. I don't know what we're doing here.
We're loving it. No, that's good. I mean,
but yes,
sense.
Put in hours, play when you're running well, because other people, I mean, to be honest, people just deflate, really. They assume that you know what's going on, and they give you additional data points. Your confidence is high, and it can be quite devastating playing against somebody that can seemingly see through to your soul and make great decisions again and again and again and again. So yeah, 100%, you should be playing more when you're winning and crushing than when you're stuck and steaming. But we're also human beings, and I don't think we're exactly wired to go about poker in the rational way.
I don't think we're wired to play poker at all. Like, we have to go against all sorts of instincts, which is why I think it's important to understand how like a typical human being would react in a game of imperfect information. And we're doing all the wrong things, starting out as human beings, including, yours truly, obviously. Like I often tell my students, I've done every mistake imaginable in the book. I'm not, if you want to call me a hypocrite, yes, I am. I've made all of these mistakes, so I'm not trying to.
Oh, my past is riddled with shameful decisions and behavior, and it's embarrassing to look back on it, because yeah, I have a good memory, and it can be both a blessing and a curse remembering how I used to be.
Exactly. Which sort of like brings us to the last question we wanted to address, right? I mean, at what level should players start thinking about heuristics, you think? At what, skill level?
I think at the beginning of this conversation, like I've sort of changed my mind here at the end. And I think that the first thing is to recognize that these heuristics are not set in stone, and that there's room for them to be upgraded. And from that paradigm, I would say that you can set them early if you so choose, under the assumption and the agreement that you make with yourself that they're suspect eventually, right? Because I do think that they are beneficial, that it does help chunk information together and helps allows you to have the bandwidth to think about other situations. However, you should go back and revisit those and challenge them and actively challenge them. And when faced with competing information or information that says, oh, this is not good, change your mind, change your opinion, and use that as a mechanism to grow. So at what level? I think early on, if that's the paradigm. And if it's not the paradigm, then never. You should never create any heuristic for yourself ever.
That's a very good point. The only thing I would add to that is just make sure they're your own heuristics, so you can own up to your own errors, right? I mean, you have sort of like a skin in the game. You can mess up on your own heuristics, because if you take somebody else's heuristics, they were never yours.
Don't outsource them.
That's right. You cannot outsource heuristics, right? Make your own mistakes so you can learn from them, right?
And this applies so directly to solvers specifically. Don't outsource your heuristic to a solver and be like, well, but Coach Brad, the solver says to do that. Like, yo, fuck your solver. I don't take orders from your solver, buddy.
Seriously, maybe that should be the title of today's podcast. I seriously think that detrimental. I think people who cannot beat the game on their own, I don't think they should be using solvers. And the reason for that is because they're a very advanced tool, and one needs to understand exactly what sort of underlying assumptions are going into it. Because if they did understand the assumptions deeply, like, the game theoretical assumptions that go in, the idea of indifference and the things like that, they would change their mind. I think there was actually another funny story. There was a conversation between Doug Polk, who, I admire to no end. I mean, I wrote a review on his Heads Up No Limit game. It's exceptional. I've been working with Upswing Poker for a long time. I've written articles for them. Huge respect. And then they had an interesting discussion with Phil Hellmuth. I don't know if you saw that interview. I think it was about like a year ago.
I saw it, but I didn't see it.
Got it. Makes sense. Yeah,
I watched a little bit of it, but I didn't watch the whole thing, I think.
Phil Hellmuth, he's very interesting to me. Like, I find him interesting as a human being. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of things that he does, but I think he's interesting. And then they had this conversation with Doug, and the conversation went something like this. Doug says, well, aren't you afraid that people who are going to be using solvers, they're going to be sitting next to you and they really, sort of like don't care what you do? And then Phil Hellmuth asked, are they going to be sitting next to me when they actually push me, or are they going to be sitting like behind a screen? I mean, he was being cheeky there. And actually, Doug was completely distracted at that point. He wasn't even listening. He said, well, anyway, so he said, well, of course, you can look at them. But then Doug said, erroneously, right? He said, but they don't really care. They're indifferent to what you do.
Yeah, which is great to me.
which is wrong, actually, because that makes the assumption. Here's the thing. Here's why it's wrong. And it's very subtle. Indifference in game theory optimal situation assumes that your opponent cannot see your hand, because the major assumption that goes into any solver is that, and again, probably like the easier way would be with, let's say that you have a bluff catcher, and solver tells you you're supposed to call that river 30% of the time with your bluff catcher. That assumes that the solver doesn't know if the opponent bets with the nuts, with the bluff, or anything in between. That's a very important assumption. If the solver could actually see the opponent's hand, they wouldn't actually give you a 30% answer. They would give you either a 0 or 100%. So that indifference goes out the window when there is reading capabilities in a live setting. This is very subtle and very important. I mean, it sounds like, now that I'm mentioning it, sounds kind of obvious, but people are thinking to themselves, even someone who's like world class at this point, right? I mean, again, he was distracted. I love Doug. He's one of the best players in the world. But like, even someone at his level, he can make the mistake and use the word indifference when it doesn't apply. So you have to be very careful. The moment somebody can hand read in any way, can sort of like see your hand or approximate your hand, then all of that indifference GTO goes out of the window. You gotta be very careful when we're making.
I would also say too that's a really good point, that hand reading and data points affect the output dramatically, and also to indifference. And then I guess we can close. Sorry, Chris, we gave you a long one this week to mix and master. Indifference is not very exciting to me.
Okay.
I don't know. Like, I mean, no, just like, if what you're doing means that you're indifferent to what I do, then it doesn't matter what I do. Why do I even need to look at the solver at all to figure out what I'm supposed to do? Because you're just indifferent to any action that I take.
Right. So what happens there, like I can only, like address this mathematically, but what happens there, it's sort of like you're finding, I don't want to use the word optimal, but you find like the best sort of like response that makes you indifferent to what your opponent is doing, right? So you still have to do a lot of work. You cannot just like, you cannot do anything and be indifferent. You have to choose the right move so that your opponent is indifferent, right? And usually this comes in some sort of like a percentage breakdown. So you have to bet that river, like let's say 70% of the time.
Right.
That will make your opponent, yeah.
My point is like, I would rather do something that makes them make a big mistake.
I agree with you 100%.
Be indifferent, right? Like
that's 100%. Exactly. Exactly. Why not take advantage of because again, you may be indifferent, but why do you need to be indifferent, right? I mean, your opponent may have a tendency to overcall or overfold. Why not take advantage of that? And I would agree with that.
And you should, because we're playing poker here against human beings. And from all of what I've learned, it's that human beings do not play like Pio in pretty much any situation that I've ever found, just in all my data research, which is quite important.
That's right. I will take out the should because I'm picky and this is Philosophical Friday, but I totally agree with you 100%. Do whatever you want, it's like, but I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. All right, man. Anything left to add in this discussion on heuristics?
No, I just want to say I really love the discussion today. It was a lot of fun talking to you. Like you brought some very excellent points. I like having my ideas in general challenged, and specifically some of these heuristics, because that gives me sort of like, I want to try different things. I always try different things, and I want to try some different things.
Oh, I mean, I have, yeah. I think there's a quote. I don't know who quoted it, but
doesn't
basically
matter.
it was like in your 20s, it's super exciting to gather knowledge and learn. Like learning is super exciting, and you're pumped. I think it was probably Tim Urban, at Wait But Why, but. And then in your 30s, you discover the beauty of unlearning things, and that's also its own excitement thing. Where like, oh wow, I get to unlearn these things that like I thought were true, right. And that 1000% applies to my life and my belief system. I'm, as I mentioned before, 1000% different. I've changed all foundational beliefs about life and experience. I've changed all of them pretty much from when I was like an 18-year-old. So anyway, there is this beauty in unlearning things and growth.
Do you know who was master at this? Like unlearning things? And he's actually Pablo Picasso. He would do like the same drawing, and every time he would start removing things. It's like, oh no, I don't need this. Like he would do like the same painting like 1,000 times and remove stuff. Or so I've been told, because I mean, I'm not an artist, so I don't understand. But apparently he was really good at that.
Right. And so we can close with this Pablo Picasso quote that I think I've quoted like 1,700 times on the podcast so far.
Awesome.
But yeah, basically learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. Exactly. So learn the rules so that you can break them.
Beautiful. Well said.
With that said, well, it was Picasso, allegedly. Who knows? It could have been somebody else. It is lost in the annals of history.
It doesn't matter. It's yours now at this point. It doesn't matter,
Suck on that, Picasso. Take that, buddy. All right, man. Yeah, great stuff. And we will see you next week.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure, Brad. Take care.